Early March 1943, sitting at Port Moresby in Papua New Guinea. The wrench clattered to the concrete floor, slipping from Captain Paul Gunn's oil-covered fingers as he studied the bomber before him. What lay inside that aircraft shouldn't exist. It violated every single regulation the United States Army Air Force had written into its rulebook. His commanding officer had never given official approval for any of this. 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns jutted out from where a bombardier's clear glass nose cone should have been. The B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, designed for precision bombing runs from high altitude, had been completely transformed. Now it was something else entirely, a ship killer, a merchant destroyer, an unauthorized experiment that would either turn the tide in the Pacific or send a man to a firing squad. But nobody, not even Gunn himself, realized that this unauthorized rebuild, born from desperation and personal rage, would lead to the most crushing naval defeat Japan would experience across the entire Pacific War. The math for Allied victory in the Southwest Pacific wasn't being calculated in strategy rooms approved by Washington officials. It was being worked out in welding bays and maintenance sheds by a 43-year-old maverick fighting a war all his own. The path to this moment had started 2 years back, on December 8, 1941, in Manila. Paul Irvin Gunn, a man nobody called by any nickname except those who knew him well, stood at Nichols Field watching Japanese bombers systematically tear apart the American Air Force stationed in the Philippines. Running Philippine Airlines, he had 4 twin-engine civilian transport planes under his control. Within hours, Major General Louis Brereton would seize those aircraft and commission Gunn as a captain in the Army Air Corps. What should have been a short wartime assignment would stretch into 3 years of tinkering, payback, and technological breakthrough. Gunn was 42, a former Navy Chief Petty Officer who'd spent 20 years as an enlisted naval aviator before hanging it up in December 1939. He'd learned to fly during the 1920s, had flown with the famous Top Hatters Squadron, and later taught other pilots at Pensacola Naval Air Station. He knew planes from the inside out, not from reading manuals, but from 20 years of working on them, flying them, and sometimes crashing them. But that December morning, knowing aircraft didn't matter much. Gunn had a bigger, more immediate crisis. His wife, Clara Louise, everybody called her Polly, and their 4 children were in Manila while Japanese forces pushed closer. His 2 sons, Paul Jr. and Nathan, were teenagers. His daughters, Connie and Julie, were still young. The family had been living a comfortable expatriate life in Manila while Gunn ran the airline, but that life ended overnight. In the chaotic weeks that followed, Gunn flew reconnaissance and transport runs across the falling Philippine defenses. He evaded Japanese fighters, crashed in jungle and walked out alive, then climbed right back into another plane. On one flight, he earned a Distinguished Flying Cross by piloting an unarmed cargo plane into a combat zone to drop medical supplies to trapped American soldiers, threading through Japanese-controlled airspace using nothing but skill and nerve. He still couldn't reach his family. Christmas Eve 1941 came, and orders arrived to pull key personnel out to Australia. He withdrew all his military pay, borrowed whatever money he could get from other officers, and prepared to evacuate his family to safety. But the Japanese were moving too fast. His family couldn't make it to the airfield in time. Gunn faced an impossible choice: abandon them or ignore his orders. He flew to Australia because orders were orders, because the war mattered more than one family, because staying meant death or capture for everyone. Just weeks later, on January 20th, 1942, Polly and the children were taken by Japanese forces and locked in the University of Santo Tomas, which had been turned into a prison camp for foreign civilians. Something inside Gunn snapped when he learned where his family was. The man who continued fighting wasn't the same person who'd left Manila. He'd left behind his wife and 4 children in enemy hands, an enemy known for cruelty. Every single day they sat in that camp was another day Gunn couldn't protect them. The only weapon he had was to end this war faster. If he couldn't save them directly, he could destroy every ship, every plane, every supply line, keeping Japanese soldiers in the Philippines. This wasn't official military policy. This was revenge dressed up as technological progress. When Major General George C. Kenney rolled into Brisbane in late July 1942 To take command of the Southwest Pacific Air Forces, he inherited chaos. His predecessor had been fired, morale was shot, the equipment was falling apart. Japanese planes owned the skies over New Guinea and were eyeing Australia itself. Theatre Commander General Douglas MacArthur didn't trust his air forces, and he made that crystal clear. Kenny was 53, a First World War fighter pilot with 2 confirmed enemy kills and a Silver Star. He'd taught at the Air Corps Tactical School and earned a reputation for thinking differently. When MacArthur spent an hour lecturing him about everything wrong with Allied air power, Kenny listened, then asked for one thing: the authority to send home anybody he thought was dead weight. MacArthur, caught off guard, said yes. Within weeks, Kenny shuffled his entire command, bringing in younger, aggressive officers and putting a forward headquarters in New Guinea to make decisions faster instead of waiting for Brisbane to respond. He made Brigadier General NSC Whitehead his forward commander, giving him power to reassign planes based on weather and combat needs, rather than sticking to Brisbane's orders. But shuffling people meant nothing without better weapons. Bombers attacking from medium and high altitude were getting demolished by Japanese ships. High-altitude bombing gave enemy ships time to dodge. B-17 flying fortresses were connecting on less than 1% of targets. Japanese supply convoys were resupplying New Guinea garrisons without any trouble. Soldiers dying in the jungle watched fresh Japanese troops pour off ships that bombers couldn't touch. Kenny had been turning an idea over in his head since 1928, when he taught at tactical school. He'd theorized about skip bombing, releasing bombs at wave-top height so they'd bounce across water like pebbles on a pond, smashing into ship hulls below the waterline where armor was thinnest. The theory made sense. Making it work was harder. B-17s didn't have machine guns pointing forward. Coming in at mast height meant flying through deadly anti-aircraft fire with nothing to fight back. Then Kenny found out about Paul Gunn, and everything shifted. In August 1942, Kenny discovered that someone in the 3rd Attack Group was modifying P-40 Warhawk light bombers without approval. The changes were crude, but they worked. Someone had pulled the bombardier out of that transparent nose and crammed 4 50-caliber machine guns in there instead, all pointing forward. The idea was to tear up Japanese positions from extremely low altitude, hammering ground fire before dropping bombs. Kenny tracked down who was doing it and found Captain Paul Gunn pretty much working alone, pulling weapons from destroyed fighters and bolting them onto attack planes. Gunn had picked up aircraft modification through experimentation and mistakes. He didn't have a formal engineering background, but 20 years of hands-on aircraft work had taught him structures, weight, and weapons systems. Most commanders would have court-martialed Gunn for unauthorized aircraft modification. Kenny put him on his personal staff as Special Projects Officer and handed him an insane assignment: modify every A-20 in the region for low-altitude fighting and do it yesterday. Gunn ran on coffee and barely slept, 16, 18 hours a day. He scrounged guns from wrecked aircraft, welded together mounting hardware in improvised workshops, and personally tested every single modification. He bolted 50-caliber machine guns to each A-20's nose, strapped more guns along the sides of the fuselage, and hung bomb racks for anti-personnel fragmentation bombs. When these rebuilt A-20s went into battle in September 1942, hitting a Japanese airfield at Buna, they exceeded every expectation. The machines came in at treetop height, guns screaming, neutralizing flak positions before releasing their bombs. Japanese troops, used to high-altitude bombers they could see coming for minutes, got no warning. The attack pulverized dozens of parked aircraft and proved that flying low and shooting could change everything about combat flying. Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to start work on the same kind of changes for B-25 Mitchell medium bombers. The Mitchell was bigger than the A-20, flew farther, hauled more bombs, and could carry way more forward-pointing guns. If Gunn could convert the Mitchell into a gunship, it would become the theater's best anti-shipping weapon. The B-25 Mitchell had been drawn up in 1939 as a medium-altitude level bomber. It had 2 engines, wings spanning 67 feet 7 inches, powered by twin Wright R2600 engines, each cranking out 1,700 horsepower. Standard guns were 650 caliber machine guns for defense and 3,000 pounds of bombs. 5 crew members flew her: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, and gunner. They'd named it after General Billy Mitchell, the air power crusader who'd been court-martialed way back in 1925 for speaking his mind too loudly. Builders would end up making approximately 9,890 B-25s across 2 North American aviation factories, one near Los Angeles in Inglewood and another in Kansas City. The B-25 became famous in April 1942 when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle flew 16 of them off the aircraft carrier USS Hornet on a daring strike against Tokyo itself. The raid didn't destroy much physically, but it gave Americans something to feel good about again after Pearl Harbor's devastation. More importantly, it made Japan keep fighter planes home for mainland defense instead of shipping them to battle zones. But the B-25's main job was still medium-altitude bombing, a job it was proving useless for against ships. Gunn looked at the Mitchell and spotted potential nobody else could see. The nose section was roomy enough for several heavy guns. The twin engines meant losing one wouldn't kill the plane. The frame was tough enough to take punishment. Most important, the Mitchell had enough fuel to reach Japanese shipping lanes that shorter-range A-20s couldn't touch. Starting in late 1942, Gunn started reworking B-25s in a maintenance facility down in Townsville, Australia. He partnered with Captain Jack Fox, the North American aviation field rep in theater. Fox was supposed to make sure changes matched factory plans. Instead, he became Gunn's partner in what turned out to be the war's most productive secret modification program. The first job was ditching the bombardier and his glass nose. That meant less weight and getting rid of a spot nobody needed for ground-level attacks. Gunn filled the space with a steel nose packed with 4 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. Everyone firing forward, all controlled by the pilot, 500 rounds per gun. Firing speed of roughly 850 rounds every minute from each gun meant a pilot could send a hurricane of bullets that would shred anything in seconds. 4 guns wasn't enough for Gunn. He mounted 2 more 50 caliber guns in side blisters on either side of the forward fuselage, sitting just below and back from the cockpit. These wing guns stuck out past the propeller sweep, letting them fire without bullets passing through the spinning props. They pointed forward like the others, adding to the pilot's raw firepower. Then Gunn did something radical. The B-25 had a rotating turret on top with 2 50 caliber guns behind the cockpit. This thing could swing to defend against attacks from above and from behind. Gunn locked that turret pointing straight ahead, giving 2 more guns to the pilot's arsenal. Now the co-pilot could work these guns with a sight in the cabin, or the pilot could squeeze the master trigger and fire everything at once. This rebuilt B-25 now had 8 forward-pointing 50 caliber machine guns spraying about 180 pounds of metal per second. A single P-51 Mustang fighter carried just 6 50 caliber guns for comparison. This modified B-25 had more forward firepower than an entire fighter plane, plus 2,000 pounds of bombs underneath. These changes created massive engineering headaches. Hanging 8 guns and ammunition up front shifted weight forward, making the nose too heavy and the plane hard to steer. Gunn fixed this by moving equipment toward the tail and adding weight back there. Firing 8 guns together created crazy structural stress. Gunn braced the nose with extra support. The guns threw off tremendous heat and smoke. Gunn built ventilation and relocated ammunition storage to lower fire danger. The biggest issue was gun convergence. All 8 guns had to cross their fire at one specific point out front, normally somewhere between 200 and 400 yards away. Get the alignment wrong and bullets sprayed everywhere except the target. Gunn created a ground test setup with targets at measured spots, tweaking each gun mount until all 8 weapons crossed fire perfectly. He personally test-fired the guns, making tiny corrections, refusing to sign off on planes that weren't absolutely perfect. The whole modification on one plane took roughly 2 weeks when working round the clock. Gunn coached maintenance people through the process, setting up assembly line procedures. By December 1942, he'd finished enough B-25s for the 91st Bombardment Squadron. The squadron needed a commander who grasped low-altitude tactics and wasn't going to follow bombing textbooks. They picked Major Ed Larson, an officer who'd jumped from junior ranks to major in weeks thanks to his bold combat flying. Larson had shown real skill on ground-level missions and had Kenny's confidence. Larson and Gunn designed the methods that would remake sea warfare. These rebuilt B-25s would approach Japanese ships super low, sometimes just 50 feet above the ocean, moving at top speed, roughly 300 miles per hour. At that altitude and speed, ship gunners couldn't track them. The speed was too quick for hand-operated guns, and the planes were history before operators could correct their aim. Coming in, pilots would trigger all 8 forward guns at roughly 1,000 yards out, sweeping fire across the target. 50 caliber slugs would rake the decks, cutting down anti-aircraft crews, destroying gun emplacements, tearing up the superstructure, causing complete chaos. The gunfire wasn't meant to sink the ship by itself, though damage could be heavy. The goal was to knock out the ship's guns and shake up the crew. Then came the bombs. At 200 to 400 yards distance, flying at minimum safe altitude, the pilot would release bombs with a 4 to 5 second delayed fuse. The bomb leaves the aircraft still doing 300 miles per hour, crashes into the water, and bounces across the top. It bounces once, maybe twice, then slams into the ship's side at or below the waterline. The delayed fuse keeps it from blowing up on impact. Instead, it punches through the hull, sinks below the surface, then detonates. The blast goes off in the weakest spot, below the armor belt where hulls are thinnest. Water doesn't compress, so the shockwave spreads devastation. One bomb going off below the waterline can snap a ship's spine, blow tanks open, flood the engine room, cause total structural breakdown. By the time the bomb ignites, the B-25 is already past, climbing fast to escape the explosion. The whole attack, first shots to bombs released, happens in about 10 seconds. Skip bombing wasn't brand new. Britain had messed with it. Some American pilots tried it on their own, but linking skip bombing with massive forward guns was Gunn's contribution. The gun-equipped nose turned the bomber into its own fighter protection, crushing defenses before bombs landed. Nothing else could match it. While Gunn was reworking planes, Allied codebreakers were tracking Japanese ships. Ultra intercepts, the operation that cracked Japanese naval codes, were giving clear information about enemy operations. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, or FRUMEL, was translating Japanese traffic nearly as it happened. In late February 1943, FRUMEL picked up traffic showing a massive Japanese convoy gathering at Rabaul on New Britain. They were heading toward Lae on New Guinea's north shore. They were carrying troops and equipment for Japanese soldiers fighting in Papua. The intelligence was exact. 8 transports would carry roughly 6,900 soldiers from the 51st Division. 8 destroyers would ride along as protection. The Japanese convoy would slip out of Simpson Harbor at Rabaul just after midnight on February 28, 1943, and was expected to reach Lae approximately 3 days later. This represented Japan's all-out effort to reinforce its forces in New Guinea. Success meant the Japanese could substantially strengthen their position and potentially stem the tide of Allied advances. Failure, however, carried a different kind of weight. Japan would lose thousands of hardened, experienced troops. The Navy would suffer devastating losses. Another major reinforcement attempt by sea might never happen again. General Kenny understood the magnitude of the moment. Here was his chance to test his redesigned aircraft and his unconventional tactics against the most vital targets since Pearl Harbor itself. He moved quickly, gathering every operational aircraft available in the theater and coordinating them for a massive, unified assault. The attacking force would be diverse and coordinated. Heavy B-17 flying fortresses would bomb from medium altitude. Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters would come in low and fast, guns blazing. P-38 Lightning fighters would provide top cover. And then came the real innovation, modified B-25 strafers equipped for skip bombing, a technique still being refined but promising devastating results. It would be the Southwest Pacific's largest coordinated air operation to date. On February 28th, commanders personally briefed every squadron leader. The orders were crystal clear. Find the convoy, attack relentlessly, show no mercy, sink every vessel. This wasn't a raid. This was total destruction. At precisely midnight on February 28, 1943, the Japanese convoy departed Simpson Harbor. Admiral Masatomi Kimura commanded from the destroyer Shirayuki. The convoy comprised 8 cargo transports: Kyokomaru, Kenbumaru, Teomaru, Nojima, Ayomaru, Taimei-maru, Shinai-maru, and Oigawa-maru. 8 destroyers provided escort: Shirayuki, Asashio, Arashio, Tokitsukaze, Yukikaze, Uranami, Shikinami, and Asagumo. Roughly 100 Japanese Zero fighters would provide air cover throughout the voyage. This was the strongest force Japan had assembled for any resupply mission. Kimura knew from experience that losses were inevitable. Every convoy to New Guinea before this one had come under attack, but Japanese commanders were convinced enough ships would get through to make it worthwhile. They were profoundly mistaken. That afternoon, an Allied B-24 Liberator on patrol spotted the convoy. The pilot radioed the position, course, and composition back to base. Kenny's command immediately launched reconnaissance aircraft to maintain contact. At first, weather conditions favored the Japanese. 2 tropical storms moved across the region, bringing clouds and reducing visibility. Allied aircraft stayed with the convoy but couldn't mount effective attacks through the weather. The convoy pressed ahead at 7 knots, barely 8 miles per hour. The slow speed was dictated by the heavily laden transports. The destroyers could have raced along at 20 knots or faster, but they had to match the convoy's pace. By nightfall on March 1st, they'd covered roughly 90 miles. They were perhaps halfway to Leh. The weather continued to worsen, which suited Kimura perfectly. Fewer aircraft would fly in these conditions. But the rough seas pounded the transports mercilessly. Packed below deck in crowded airless holds, the troops suffered terribly from seasickness. On the morning of March 2, 1943, conditions cleared somewhat. Allied reconnaissance planes re-established visual contact. Around 10 in the morning, 29 B-17 Flying Fortresses descended to 5,000 feet and began their bombing runs. The high-altitude bombing proved predictably ineffective. The B-17s reported hits, but Japanese records show only minimal damage, possibly 1 transport slightly damaged. The real purpose of the attack was harassment. It forced the convoy to maneuver constantly, slowing their progress toward Leh. Throughout March turn, more B-17 strikes came in. The Flying Fortresses dropped dozens of bombs from various altitudes. Ships twisted and turned to avoid the falling ordnance. Japanese fighters climbed to intercept. Several B-17s took damage. 3 Zero fighters fell in flames, yet no ships went down. The high-altitude bombing was annoying the Japanese, but not stopping them. As darkness fell on March 2nd, Kenny knew the real test would come at dawn. The modified B-25s were ready. Major Paul Gunn had drilled his pilots repeatedly. They'd practiced the skip bombing profile on a wrecked vessel on February 28th, running through combined formations of B-17s, B-25s, P-38s, and Beaufighters. Every pilot knew his role. The skip bombing technique had been perfected. Gun harmonization was precise. Ordnance was loaded and armed. The moment of decision was approaching. But dawn on March 3, 1943, revealed perfect conditions. Clear skies stretched horizon to horizon. Visibility was excellent. The sea lay calm and still. Admiral Kimura must have felt something cold settle in his chest. His convoy was just 30 miles from Leh, close enough that shore-based anti-aircraft batteries might offer some support, yet still completely vulnerable to air attack. The Allied strike force had assembled at Cape Ward Hunt on Papua's northern coast. Around 90 Allied aircraft converged on the Japanese convoy: B-17 Flying Fortresses, modified B-25 strafers, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters, and P-38 Lightning fighters for protection. Attack waves would come throughout the day from different directions and altitudes. The assault began around 10 in the morning. B-17 struck first from medium altitude, capturing attention and forcing evasive maneuvers. Then the low-level attackers arrived. Beaufighters screamed in first, their 20mm cannons and 6 machine guns spitting fire, suppressing anti-aircraft defenses. The destroyers responded with everything they possessed, but the attackers' closing speed was too fast, their approach too aggressive. When the modified B-25 strafers appeared, the slaughter began in earnest. The modified B-25 strafers came in multiple waves throughout the morning. One pilot picked the transport Kyoko Maru as his target and pushed his nose down to 50 feet above the water. At 1,000 yards, he opened fire. 85 caliber machine guns, 6 of them, poured out rounds at a combined rate of 2,800 per minute. 180 pounds of projectiles every second ripped into the transport's hull and superstructure. Tracers showed exactly where the bullets were going. The fire walked from bow toward bridge, shredding metal, canvas, and flesh. Sailors crumpled where they stood. Anti-aircraft guns exploded into scrap. The bridge disintegrated under the hammering impacts. Metal fragments scattered like deadly confetti. Then he released his bombs. 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs with delayed fuses fell away cleanly. They hit the water 200 yards from the ship, skipped once, and slammed into the hull just below the waterline amidships. The pilot pulled up hard and banked away. Behind him, the bombs detonated. 2 massive underwater explosions ripped the transport's bottom open. Kyoko Maru heaved violently upward. Water surged into the engine room and holds. The ship began sinking immediately, listing heavily to port. It would disappear beneath the surface in 15 minutes. Other modified B-25s followed in successive waves, each selecting a target, each executing the same devastating attack. Guns blazing, bombs skipping, ships exploding. Kenbu Maru took multiple hits from at least 3 B-25s. Combined gunfire killed most crew on deck. 4 bombs punched through below the waterline. The transport broke in half and sank in under 10 minutes. Teomaru was strafed so intensely that fires erupted across its superstructure. 2 bombs opened the hull like a tin can. The transport sank with nearly 1,000 troops still trapped aboard. Nojima tried to maneuver but was far too slow. A B-25 strafe raked it from stern to bow, then planted 2 more bombs in the engine room. The ship lost power and began flooding. It would go down later that day. The Beaufighters and remaining B-25s turned on the destroyers. Shirayuki, Admiral Kimura's flagship, took strafing fire that killed nearly everyone on the bridge. Kimura himself was wounded in the hail of bullets. A bomb struck near the stern, igniting the magazine. Secondary explosions tore the stern section clean away. The destroyer sank. Yukikaze took direct bomb hits that ignited the fuel tanks. The destroyer transformed into a floating inferno and sank within the hour. Arashio collided with the transport Nojima while maneuvering and suffered catastrophic damage. The destroyer was abandoned and sank. Throughout the attack, Japanese Zero fighters fought desperately to protect the convoy, but the P-38 Lightnings engaged them at high altitude, while the B-25s operated at masthead height, too low for fighters to attack safely without risking their own ships. The coordination was perfect, mechanical, devastating. The attack lasted approximately 40 minutes. When the Allied aircraft pulled away to rearm and refuel, the scene was apocalyptic. 4 transports were sinking or already sunk. 3 destroyers were gone. The remaining ships were scattered and damaged, all in chaos. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and sailors thrashed in the water. Bodies drifted among the wreckage. Oil slicks burned on the surface. That afternoon, Allied aircraft returned for follow-up strikes. Modified B-25s found the surviving ships limping toward Leh. The attacks were methodical and merciless. Each ship was targeted individually. The strafers came in low, guns blazing, bombs skipping. Ships exploded. The destroyer Asashio, already damaged, took more bombs and went under. By nightfall on March 3rd, all 8 transports and 4 of the 8 destroyers had been sunk. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead or drowning. Another 2,700 would be rescued by surviving destroyers and submarines dispatched from Rabaul. Only about 1,200 troops would ultimately reach Leh, many without weapons or equipment. Of the 6,900 troops originally embarked, more than 5,700 were casualties. The convoy had been annihilated. Allied losses were remarkably light. 1 B-17 Flying Fortress was shot down. 3 P-38 fighters were lost in combat. 13 aircrew were killed. Compared to Japanese losses, it was barely a scratch. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as it became known, marked a turning point in the Pacific War. It proved conclusively that land-based aircraft could destroy a heavily escorted naval convoy. It validated skip bombing when combined with overwhelming firepower. It confirmed every modification gun had made to the B-25. Most critically, it convinced Japan that resupplying garrisons by sea in the Southwest Pacific was no longer possible. Japan would never again attempt a major convoy to New Guinea. Japanese forces there would slowly starve as supplies dwindled to nothing. General MacArthur issued a communique claiming 22 ships sunk, including 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers, with over 12,000 troops killed. The actual numbers were lower but still catastrophic. The exaggerations were typical of wartime propaganda. What mattered was the strategic result. Gunn had proven his concepts worked. Skip bombing was viable. Modified bombers were effective. Low-altitude attacks could succeed despite heavy defenses. Paul Gunn, watching from Australia as the reports came in, must have felt grim satisfaction. His modifications had destroyed a Japanese convoy. His aircraft had killed thousands of enemy soldiers. Yet his family remained imprisoned at Santo Tomas, and the war was nowhere near finished. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea's success triggered immediate expansion of the modification program. Kenny ordered every available B-25 in the theater converted to strafe configuration. Gunn worked even harder, training additional crews, refining techniques, boosting production. By mid-1943, most B-25s in the Southwest Pacific had been modified. North American Aviation, the manufacturer, took notice. Company representatives visited Gunn's workshops, examined the modifications, and requested detailed specifications. They wanted to incorporate his innovations into factory production. Gunn was promoted to major and sent back to the United States to work with North American Aviation at their Inglewood and Kansas City plants. Over several months in 1943 and early 1944, he collaborated with engineers to design a factory-produced strafe version of the B-25. The result was the B-25G, which mounted a 75mm cannon in the nose, along with 450 caliber machine guns. 425 B-25Gs were built and deployed throughout the war. The 75mm cannon packed tremendous destructive force. Its 14.7-pound shells could slice through ship armor or obliterate reinforced bunkers. Yet the weapon presented serious challenges. Loading demanded careful coordination, it required a dedicated crew member positioned in the nose, and its rate of fire remained painfully slow. Gunn knew the only way to prove its worth was to take the B-25G into actual combat himself. He led a raid against a Japanese destroyer, commanding the 3rd Attack Group directly into danger. The cannon round screamed toward the target and struck the fire control system with devastating precision. The destroyer's ability to coordinate its gun batteries evaporated in an instant. Without that central control, the ship lay vulnerable. Conventional bombs followed, raining down and finishing what the cannon had started, sending the vessel to the bottom. Publicly, Gunn proclaimed that the 75mm had sunk the destroyer single-handedly, a claim that captured the weapon's potential in headlines. Privately, however, he acknowledged the truth. The bombs had delivered the killing blow. The cannon had crippled, the bombs had killed. The B-25H entered production next, building upon the G model's foundation. 2,000 of these aircraft rolled off assembly lines, each equipped with the 75mm cannon and machine guns positioned in different configurations throughout the fuselage. The H model introduced significant changes. The dorsal turret relocated forward, the co-pilot position eliminated entirely to trim weight. Now the navigator bore the additional duty of loading that troublesome cannon. The firepower was extraordinary, but it came with a steep price in handling characteristics. The aircraft became nose-heavy and sluggish. Control inputs felt sluggish and unpredictable. The Army Air Force's Development Center at Wright Field grew alarmed enough to send Gunn an official message. The modification endangered aircraft and crews. They demanded the planes be grounded immediately until engineers resolved the center of gravity problem. The story of Gunn's response may have been embellished over the years, but whether apocryphal or genuine, it perfectly captured his mentality. His alleged reply cut straight to the point: store the center of gravity concerns for after the war. Right now, there was fighting to do. Gun's philosophy rejected the notion that perfection mattered more than practical combat effectiveness. His pilots adapted to the handling difficulties through experience and skill. They learned to compensate, to anticipate, to muscle the aircraft through maneuvers that should have been impossible. The final production variant, the B-25J, struck a compromise. Some aircraft retained the conventional bombardier's nose, while others kept the strafing nose with its forward-firing arsenal. Engineers and pilots got options based on mission requirements. The J model became the most prolific variant, with 4,318 aircraft constructed. These machines bristled with weaponry in staggering quantities: 8 forward-firing guns mounted in the nose, 4 guns positioned in cheek blisters along the fuselage, twin guns in the dorsal turret, and 4 more in tail positions. Total machine gun armament could reach 1,150 caliber, an unprecedented concentration of firepower. No bomber of World War II carried such devastating offensive capability. Most combat situations never demanded this extreme firepower, yet its psychological impact proved invaluable. Enemy soldiers developed a primal dread at the sound. Japanese troops learned that the distinctive roar of Mitchell engines meant death descending from above. That distinctive mechanical howl signaled incoming devastation, and there was nowhere to hide. Throughout 1943 and 1944, these modified Mitchells carved through Japanese targets across the Pacific Theater. In August 1943, B-25 strafers descended upon Japanese airfields at Wewak in New Guinea, flying so low that ground fire seemed impossible to avoid. The assault obliterated 174 aircraft parked on the ground, a stunning blow that shattered Japanese air power's backbone in that entire region. Such range required innovation, however. Wewak pushed the B-25's reach to its absolute limit. Gun engineered a solution using auxiliary fuel tanks installed in the bomb bay. Once the fuel burned away, crews opened a floor panel and jettisoned the empty tanks through the hole. The system remained crude. Fuel fumes seeped throughout the fuselage, and a constant cold breeze whistled through the aircraft cabin. But it extended operational range by several hundred vital miles. This stretched reach opened entirely new tactical possibilities. The Wewak raids terminated Japanese air superiority over New Guinea and handed Allied ground commanders the freedom to advance with minimal aerial threats. In November 1943, B-25 strafers unleashed one of the war's most stunning operations against Rabaul Harbor. Major Raymond "Jock" Hennessy commanded 38 B-25s against the harbor's shipping, targets nestled in one of the war's most formidable defensive perimeters. The attack coordinated precisely with P-38 fighters providing combat air patrol, while phosphorus bombs created massive smokescreens. Within the harbor, 38 vessels awaited their fate, and 30 received direct hits. A heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and countless transports and support ships were sunk or damaged beyond repair. The raid crippled Rabaul's value as a forward operating base and shattered the illusion that even Japan's most heavily fortified positions could withstand determined air assault. During the Philippines campaign of 1944, B-25 strafers became indispensable. They provided close air support for ground forces pushing through the archipelago, cut Japanese supply lines with ruthless efficiency, and hunted shipping throughout the islands. Crews nicknamed them the Bat Out of Hell because attacks materialized so suddenly and flew so close to the ground that defenders never mounted effective resistance. Everything happened too fast. Guns modified B-25s were not the sole weapon turning the Pacific War. The conflict demanded contributions from numerous systems and countless brave soldiers. Yet among all available weapons, these aircraft proved exceptionally effective. They destroyed hundreds of vessels, annihilated thousands of aircraft on airfields, and killed tens of thousands of enemy combatants. They made MacArthur's island-hopping strategy viable by systematically cutting Japanese garrisons off from supply and reinforcement. Air superiority secured by these machines enabled amphibious landings that would have failed against any organized resistance. Meanwhile, Gunn's personal struggle continued consuming his thoughts. His family remained imprisoned at Santo Tomas. Occasional letters reached him through the Red Cross, though communication remained sporadic and heavily censored by Japanese authorities. Reports filtering through grew increasingly worrying. Camp conditions deteriorated steadily as Japan's military fortunes collapsed. The guards turned harsher, food rations shrank, disease spread rapidly through the crowded barracks. Gunn felt powerless, trapped on distant airfields while his wife and children suffered in confinement. All he could do was fly another mission, then another, pushing himself harder with every sortie, hoping that each destroyed ship brought Liberation's Day closer. In late 1944, American forces launched invasion operations into Leyte in the Philippines. At age 45, Gunn remained in combat, still flying, still searching for ways to kill the enemy with greater efficiency. On a night in late 1944, Japanese bombers attacked Tacloban airfield on Leyte. Gunn stood on the ground as the enemy release began. White phosphorus bombs exploded nearby, and jagged fragments tore into his shoulder with ferocious impact. Damage so severe it rendered his right arm essentially useless and flooded his body with agonizing pain. He was evacuated to Australia for months of painful recovery. The wound ended his flying combat career, but his war was nearly finished regardless. On February 3, 1945, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division broke through Manila's streets as a flying column. They arrived at Santo Tomas internment camp just as Japanese guards prepared to execute the camp leadership. In the chaos of urban combat raging through Manila's neighborhoods, American soldiers liberated over 4,000 prisoners. Among them were Polly Gunn and her 4 children. They had endured 3 years and 14 days of internment. Emaciated and traumatized, but miraculously alive, they emerged into freedom. General MacArthur visited the liberated camp and personally met the Gunn family, arranging immediate transport to Australia so they could reunite with Papi. Weeks later, after liberation's first shock faded, the reunion finally occurred. The man who had flown away on Christmas Eve 1941 held his family again. Polly had maintained family unity through circumstances that should have destroyed them. The boys, transformed into young men, had navigated the separation of male and female quarters. The girls had survived years of deprivation beyond comprehension. They were together physically, but they had become different people. War had altered them fundamentally. Gunn remained in the Army Air Forces following his recovery, accepting promotion to lieutenant colonel and shifting to aircraft modification work and tactical development. Important duties, but grounded duties. He retired on June 30, 1948, as a full colonel, medically retired because of his combat injuries. His decorations spoke of a warrior's service, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 1 oak leaf cluster, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts representing 9 separate combat wounds. Gunn returned to the Philippines and rebuilt Philippine Airlines from the ruins of occupation and liberation's destruction. The nation needed rebuilding, and air transportation would reconnect the scattered islands. He continued flying, continued taking risks, continued pushing boundaries. On October 11, 1957, 7 days before his 58th birthday, Gunn piloted a charter flight directly into a severe storm. The aircraft went down. Paul Irvin Papi Gunn died doing what he had done for 4 decades, flying. They buried him at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station Pensacola in Florida, near where he had once served as an instructor. His legacy manifested in multiple forms. The B-25 strafing modifications he pioneered remained standard practice throughout the war's remaining years. Of approximately 9,895 B-25 Mitchells built during the conflict, thousands were configured as strafers based on Gunn's designs. The skip bombing technique he perfected destroyed hundreds of Japanese vessels and contributed substantially to Allied victory. Gunn proved that innovation could emerge from anywhere. Even modifications conceived by a grieving father working in a maintenance hangar driven by desperation. The military bureaucracy wanted to fight using existing weapons and established doctrine. Gunn demonstrated that desperate circumstances demanded desperate solutions. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became required study at military academies worldwide. The combination of intelligence, coordination, revolutionary weapons, and innovative tactics achieved complete victory at minimal cost. It showcased what air power could accomplish against naval forces when properly employed. 8 transports destroyed, 4 destroyers sunk, Over 5,000 casualties inflicted, all for 4 Allied aircraft lost. The mathematics proved brutally simple. You cannot survive in an environment where enemies control the skies. Every vessel sunk in that sea represented dozens of missions that would never launch, hundreds of troops who would never fight, thousands of ammunition rounds that would never fire. Destroying supplies before they reached the battlefield represented warfare's most efficient form. The modified B-25 became the weapon system making this possible. It could range hundreds of miles searching for ships, suppress their defensive firepower with overwhelming force, destroy them through skip-bombing precision, and return to base for another sortie. One B-25 strafe accomplished what previously required coordinated attacks from multiple aircraft types. Japan grasped this lesson only after the Bismarck disaster. Japanese commanders realized large convoys could no longer move through daylight within Allied air range. They switched to nighttime movements, employed submarines for critical supplies, increasingly relied on barge traffic that hid in coastal waters during daylight hours. These measures reduced losses, but could not eliminate them. B-25 strafers hunted barges with identical efficiency. They pursued warships. Radar-equipped night-flying B-25s located convoys in darkness. No safe time existed, no safe method, no safe place for Japanese logistics in the Southwest Pacific. The stranglehold tightened month after month until Japanese garrisons faced effective isolation. In New Guinea, throughout the Philippines, across Pacific Islands, Japanese soldiers fought onward with shrinking supplies and no hope of reinforcement. Their bravery and tenacity could not overcome air superiority achieved by weapons like the modified B-25. By 1945, the modified B-25 had become the standard anti-shipping weapon throughout the Pacific. The aircraft evolved through the G, H, and J variants, each incorporating increasingly heavier armament packages. But the fundamental concept, gun's original vision, remained constant. A medium bomber converted into a flying gun platform capable of suppressing defenses and delivering devastating attacks at masthead height. When August 1945 arrived with the war's end, modified B-25s were still flying combat missions. They escorted the Japanese surrender delegation from Japan to Manila in mid-August. Fitting that aircraft instrumental in Japan's defeat would witness its formal capitulation. Post-war analysis from American and Japanese historians alike confirmed guns' innovation's significance. Japanese naval officers stated plainly that after the Bismarck Sea battle, they understood they could not safely operate in waters within Allied air range. The psychological impact rivaled physical destruction in importance. Convoy commanders knew that low-flying bombers could appear without warning and destroy entire formations before defenses could respond. Modified B-25s had created entirely new warfare where medium bombers hunted ships with submarine stealth and cruiser firepower. The implications extended far beyond Pacific operations. Post-war air forces worldwide studied skip-bombing lessons and forward-firing armament concepts. The gunship concept, aircraft designed primarily for gun attack rather than bombing, became standard in many air forces worldwide. The AC-47, AC-119, and AC-130 gunships deployed in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts represented conceptual descendants of guns modified B-25s. Of the 9,190 B-25s constructed during World War II, over 100 survive today, predominantly in the United States. Many are maintained in flying condition, appearing at air shows where spectators marvel at their size, sound, and historical significance. The distinctive roar of those Wright R2600 engines remains unforgettable. Seeing a B-25 banking low across an airfield, precisely as they flew across Japanese waters, reminds observers of these aircraft's accomplishments. Several flying B-25s are configured as strafers with forward-firing nose guns. When these weapons fire during demonstrations using blank ammunition, the sound overwhelms everything. The muzzle blast is visible. The aircraft shudders from recoil energy. Witnessing a B-25 strafe demonstration provides viewers a glimpse of what Japanese sailors experienced in their final seconds before destruction. Museums worldwide preserve B-25s in various configurations. The National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, maintains multiple examples. The National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where Gunn once instructed, displays a B-25. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum preserves additional examples. Each aircraft tells stories of innovation, desperation, and victory. In 1959, retired General George Kenney published The Saga of Pappy Gunn, a biography ensuring Gunn's contributions would not fade from memory. Kenney detailed the modifications, combat missions, and personal war to liberate his family. Kenney wrote that Gunn represented one of the Pacific War's most significant individuals, a man whose unauthorized actions saved thousands of Allied lives and shortened the conflict. Nathaniel Gunn, Pappy's youngest son, also documented his father's story. His books provided family perspectives, describing Santo Tomas conditions and the agonizing wait for liberation. The Gunn family narrative became an example of war's human costs and endurance's strength. In 1975, the United States Air Force honored Gunn posthumously by naming a training facility after him. The recognition came late, but heartfelt. Gunn had never pursued glory, he pursued effectiveness. His story, how one engineer's unauthorized modifications created a devastating weapon system, remains relevant today. Gunn refused accepting his family's imprisonment as inevitable. He refused accepting existing weapons as adequate. He refused accepting regulations preventing innovation. That combination of refusal, technical skill, and Kenney's support generated modifications that transformed warfare. The B-25 strafers destroyed hundreds of Japanese vessels, killed thousands of enemy troops, and contributed substantially to Pacific victory. Innovation emerges from unexpected sources and succeeds through unconventional methods. The modified B-25 was not the weapon winning World War II alone. That victory required millions of people employing thousands of weapons across 4 years of global conflict. Yet the modified B-25 achieved effects disproportionate to its numbers. The aircraft represented what becomes possible when necessity meets opportunity, when personal motivation aligns with military requirements, when one individual decides failure is unacceptable. Born in a maintenance hangar from desperation, it flew into combat at masthead height, with guns blazing and bombs skipping across water to penetrate hulls and explode below the waterline. It destroyed Japanese hopes of resupplying their forces. It shortened the war, it saved Allied lives, and it freed one family from 3 years of imprisonment, which was truly the point all along.